The golden California sun painted the tarmac of San Francisco International Airport as passengers shuffled through the jet bridge onto United Flight 1247 to Atlanta. The Boeing 737 hummed with the familiar pre-flight energy, carry-on bags being hoisted into overhead compartments, the rustle of boarding passes, and quiet conversations mixing with the distant whir of engines. Margaret Thompson, 78, moved slowly down the narrow aisle, her weathered hands gripping a worn leather purse and a small, carry-on bag that seemed to weigh more than she could comfortably manage. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and despite the early hour, she wore her best navy blue cardigan. The one her late husband Robert had always said brought out her eyes. "Excuse me, dear," Margaret said softly to a younger passenger blocking the aisle while organizing his belongings. The man barely acknowledged her, focused entirely on his phone screen. Behind Margaret, other passengers began to show signs of impatience. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his Rolex repeatedly, while a mother with 2 young children juggled snacks and tablets, clearly stressed about the long flight ahead. Margaret finally reached row 14, seat C, middle seat in economy. She looked up at the overhead compartment, then at her small bag, calculating the impossibility of the reach required. At 5 feet 2 inches, even in her younger days, this would have been a challenge. "Could I get some help with—" she began, turning to the flight attendant stationed nearby. Jessica Martinez, 26, was busy checking her reflection in her phone camera, adjusting her perfectly applied makeup. She had been working for the airline for just 8 months, and the novelty of the job had long since worn off. Her focus had shifted to using her position to network and hopefully catch the attention of wealthy passengers who might advance her modeling aspirations. "Ma'am, you need to keep moving. We have a schedule to keep," Jessica said without looking up from her phone, her tone sharp and dismissive. "I just need help putting my bag up there," Margaret explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't quite reach—" Jessica finally looked at Margaret, taking in her modest clothing and economy seat assignment. A smirk played at the corners of her mouth. "Maybe you should have thought about that before choosing a seat you can't handle, sweetie." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Several nearby passengers looked up from their phones and magazines, sensing the tension. Margaret's cheeks flushed pink, the embarrassment washing over her like a cold wave. I paid for this seat," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need—" "Look, lady," Jessica interrupted, her voice rising enough for other passengers to clearly hear, "I'm not your personal bellhop. Figure it out or check the bag at the gate. Some of us have work to do." A few passengers shifted, uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly man in 15A started to rise, but his wife grabbed his arm, shaking her head with a worried expression. The businessman in the aisle rolled his eyes and muttered something about delays. Margaret stood there for a moment, her bag still in her hand, feeling smaller than she had in years. The weight of not just the bag, but the humiliation, seemed to press down on her shoulders. She thought about Robert, who would have never let anyone speak to her this way, and felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. 3 rows behind this unfolding scene, Stephen Curry sat in seat 17F, his Golden State Warriors cap pulled low over his eyes. He had been scrolling through game footage on his tablet, preparing mentally for the upcoming playoff series, when the sharp exchange caught his attention. At 6'2", with a lean build honed by years of professional basketball, Stephen was used to being recognized everywhere he went. Today, however, he had hoped for a quiet flight to Atlanta where he would meet with some youth basketball program directors. The early morning departure and his deliberately casual attire, simple jeans, white t-shirt, and a navy jacket, had helped him board without the usual fanfare. But now, watching the scene unfold just a few rows ahead, Stephen felt his jaw tighten. The dismissive tone, the public humiliation of an elderly woman, the way other passengers looked away to avoid getting involved, it all struck a nerve that ran deeper than his celebrity status. Stephen's mind flashed to his own grandmother, who had raised him during some of his most formative years. He remembered countless times when strangers had shown her kindness, and the few times when they hadn't, and how those moments had affected her for days afterward. Setting down his tablet, Stephen quietly unbuckled his seatbelt. He had learned long ago that with great platform comes great responsibility, and this was one of those moments where staying silent would be complicit. The other passengers continued to pretend they weren't watching, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Margaret still stood in the aisle, her dignity hanging by a thread, while Jessica had returned to her phone, seemingly satisfied that she had made her point about not being bothered with menial tasks. What happened next would transform not just this flight, but the lives of everyone who witnessed it, proving that sometimes the most powerful moments come not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human decency when they're needed. Most Stephen Curry rose from his seat with the fluid grace of an athlete, but his movements carried none of the urgency of competition. Instead, there was a deliberate calmness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the ambient noise of the cabin. Passengers looked up as he moved past them in the aisle, some beginning to recognize the familiar face beneath the baseball cap. Margaret was still standing beside row 14, her small bag clutched against her chest like a shield. The embarrassment had settled into her features, making her appear even smaller and more fragile than her 78 years already suggested. "Ma'am," Stephen said gently, approaching Margaret with the same respect he showed his own grandmother. "Would you like me to help you with that bag?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes widening slightly. Even without knowing who he was, there was something about his presence, the genuine warmth in his voice, the way he looked directly at her as if she were the most important person on the plane, that made her shoulders relax for the first time since boarding. "Oh, that's very kind of you, young man," she said, her voice still shaky but touched with gratitude. "I just can't seem to reach." "No problem at all," Stephen smiled, taking the bag from her hands. "These overhead compartments weren't designed with everyone in mind, were they?" As Stephen easily lifted Margaret's bag into the compartment, Jessica finally looked up from her phone, annoyance clear on her face. "Sir, passengers need to take their seats. We're preparing for departure." Stephen turned to face Jessica, and in that moment several passengers gasped quietly as they recognized him. The basketball star's face was unmistakable once you really looked, the same features that graced sports magazines and endorsement deals across the country. "I was just helping this lady with her bag," Stephen said evenly, his voice carrying no hint of his celebrity status. "Something I thought was part of the service on this airline." Jessica's expression shifted as recognition dawned on her face. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden flush of realization, not just of who was standing in front of her, but of how her behavior had been witnessed by someone whose opinion could significantly impact her career. Mr. Curry," she stammered, her previous attitude evaporating like morning fog. "I didn't realize, I was just trying to keep the boarding process moving efficiently." "I understand efficiency," Stephen replied, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "But I also understand respect. This lady paid for her ticket just like everyone else on this plane. She deserves to be treated with dignity." The cabin had grown remarkably quiet. Passengers who had been buried in their phones and tablets were now openly watching the exchange. The businessman who had been checking his watch repeatedly was now recording discreetly with his phone, recognizing the significance of the moment. Margaret, now seated in 14C, looked between Stephen and Jessica with a mixture of gratitude and amazement. She had gone from feeling invisible and humiliated to being defended by someone who clearly commanded respect, though she still wasn't entirely sure who he was. "You're absolutely right," Jessica said quickly, her voice now apologetic and professional. "Ma'am," she turned to Margaret, "I apologize for my earlier behavior. That was completely unprofessional. Is there anything else I can help you with to make your flight more comfortable?" Stephen nodded approvingly, but he wasn't finished. He sat down in the empty seat next to Margaret. 17F had been a middle seat anyway, and the passenger by the window seemed more than happy to make room for the NBA star. "Mrs.?" Stephen asked Margaret. "Thompson," she replied, still somewhat bewildered by the turn of events. "Margaret Thompson." "Mrs. Thompson, I'm Stephen," he said, extending his hand with a genuine smile. "Are you traveling to Atlanta for anything special?" Margaret's face lit up for the first time since boarding. "My great-granddaughter is graduating from Emory University," she said, pride evident in her voice. "She's the first in our family to graduate from college. I wouldn't miss it for the world." "That's incredible," Stephen said, and his enthusiasm was completely genuine. "What's she studying?" As Margaret began to share stories about her great-granddaughter's journey through medical school, other passengers found themselves drawn into the conversation. The woman across the aisle, a teacher from Oakland, mentioned her own students who were first-generation college applicants. The businessman who had been so impatient earlier found himself listening intently, remembering his own grandmother's pride when he graduated. Jessica, meanwhile, retreated to the galley area, her face burning with embarrassment. She pulled out her phone and began frantically texting her supervisor, trying to get ahead of what she knew could become a significant incident. But every time she glanced back at the passengers, she saw something that made her pause. Stephen wasn't holding court or demanding special treatment. He was simply talking with Margaret as if she were the most interesting person on the plane. He asked about her late husband, listened intently as she described their 52-year marriage, and shared stories about his own grandparents that made her laugh, a sound that seemed to brighten the entire cabin. The mother with the two young children, who had been stressed about managing them during the flight, found her kids fascinated by the basketball player who was patiently answering their questions about shooting free throws. Even the elderly man in 15A, who had wanted to help Margaret earlier but had been deterred by his wife's concerns, was now engaged in a conversation about growing up in the Bay Area. What had started as an act of intervention was becoming something more, a reminder that human connection transcends social status, that kindness is contagious, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply treat others with the respect and dignity they deserve. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Margaret reached over and patted Stephen's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the bag, but for making me feel seen." Stephen squeezed her hand gently. "Thank you for reminding me what really matters, Mrs. Thompson." Neither of them realized that this conversation was being heard by dozens of other passengers, or that several people were discreetly recording moments of the interaction. The story was already beginning to spread beyond the confines of Flight 1247, but its true impact was just beginning to unfold. As Flight 1247 reached cruising altitude over the Nevada desert, the atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. What had begun as a typical anonymous flight, passengers isolated in their individual bubbles of technology and indifference, had become something resembling a community. Stephen and Margaret continued their conversation, but now it included half a dozen other passengers. The teacher from Oakland, Linda Chen, had moved to the empty seat across the aisle and was showing Margaret photos of her students on her phone. The businessman, whose name turned out to be Marcus Williams, had put away his laptop and was sharing stories about his own journey from inner-city Detroit to corporate success. "You know," Margaret said, adjusting her reading glasses to better see Linda's photos, "my great-granddaughter Jessica. Yes, same name as our flight attendant. She tutored kids all through college. Said it kept her grounded, remembering why she wanted to become a doctor in the first place." "That's beautiful," Linda replied. "It's students like your great-granddaughter who give me hope. When kids see someone who looks like them succeeding, who comes from where they come from, it changes everything they think is possible." Stephen nodded, remembering his own journey. "I had teachers who believed in me before I believed in myself. Made all the difference in the world." Meanwhile, Jessica Martinez stood in the galley, ostensibly preparing beverage service, but actually watching the interaction with a complex mix of emotions. Her supervisor had responded to her texts with concern and a request for a full report, but as she observed the genuine connection happening just a few rows away, her perspective began to shift. She thought about her own grandmother, Abuela Rosa, who had worked as a hotel housekeeper for 30 years. Rosa had always treated every guest with dignity and respect, regardless of whether they tipped well or acknowledged her existence. "Mija," she used to say, "how you treat people says nothing about them and everything about you." The memory stung now, highlighting the gap between the values she'd been raised with and the person she'd become in pursuit of what she thought was success. As Jessica began her beverage service, she found herself really looking at the passengers for the first time in months. The elderly man in 15A, who had wanted to help Margaret earlier, was traveling to his grandson's wedding. The stressed mother with 2 children was a single parent returning from a job interview, her first potential opportunity to work from home so she could spend more time with her kids. When Jessica reached Margaret's row, she paused. "Mrs. Thompson, can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, tea, water?" "Tea would be lovely, dear," Margaret replied with a warm smile that held no trace of resentment from their earlier encounter. "And you, Mr. Curry?" Jessica asked, her voice now professional but genuinely respectful. "Just water, thanks," Stephen replied. Then, after a moment, he added, "I heard you mention earlier that you're working toward other goals. What's your passion?" Jessica was taken aback by the question. Most passengers, even the famous ones, rarely engaged flight attendants in personal conversation. I was hoping to get into modeling and acting," she admitted, feeling suddenly foolish about her ambitions. "That's great," Stephen said without a hint of condescension. "The entertainment industry needs people with diverse backgrounds and experiences. What draws you to it?" As Jessica poured drinks and answered Stephen's questions, she found herself talking about things she hadn't discussed in months: her love of storytelling, her desire to represent her community in media, her grandmother's encouragement to follow her dreams while never forgetting her roots. "You know," Margaret interjected gently, "my great-granddaughter always says that whatever career you choose, the most important thing is how you treat people along the way. Success that comes at the cost of your character isn't really success at all." The words hit Jessica like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were delivered with such genuine kindness from the woman she had humiliated just hours earlier. 3 rows back, Marcus Williams was having his own moment of reflection. He had been on his phone with his assistant, trying to reschedule meetings and minimize the impact of his travel day, when he overheard Margaret talking about her late husband's work as a community organizer in rural Georgia. "He used to say that the measure of a community wasn't how it treated its most successful members, but how it treated its most vulnerable," Margaret was saying. "That's why this graduation is so important. Jessica, my great-granddaughter, she's not just achieving something for herself. She's opening doors for others who come from where we come from." Marcus thought about his own success, his corner office in Manhattan, his 6-figure salary. When was the last time he had used his position to open doors for others? When had he last thought about the community he'd left behind in Detroit? He pulled out his phone, but instead of checking emails, he began scrolling through the scholarship applications his company had received last quarter. Applications he had delegated to HR without a second thought. Perhaps it was time to get personally involved. As the flight continued eastward, crossing over the Colorado Rockies, the connections continued to deepen. Linda, the teacher, and Marcus began discussing ways his company could support educational initiatives in underserved communities. The single mother, whose name was Sarah, found herself in conversation with Margaret about the challenges and rewards of raising children while pursuing career goals. Even the other flight attendants had noticed the change in atmosphere. Tom Richardson, a veteran attendant with 15 years of experience, approached Jessica during a quiet moment. "I've been watching what's happening out there," he said quietly. "That's what this job used to be about. Creating connections, making people feel cared for during their journey. You've got a gift for it when you let it show." Jessica looked out at the passengers, no longer anonymous faces to be managed efficiently, but individuals with stories, dreams, and struggles not unlike her own. "I think I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." "It happens to all of us sometimes," Tom replied. "The question is what you do once you remember." As the plane began its descent toward Atlanta, passengers started returning to their seats and preparing for landing. But the energy in the cabin remained different, warmer, more connected. Business cards were exchanged, contact information shared, and promises made to stay in touch. Stephen looked around at the scene and smiled. This wasn't the quiet, anonymous flight he had planned, but it had become something far more valuable. He thought about the upcoming playoff series, the pressure and expectations that awaited him in Atlanta, and realized that this unexpected reminder of what really mattered couldn't have come at a better time. Margaret, meanwhile, was practically glowing with excitement about seeing her great-granddaughter, but also with the unexpected joy of having connected with so many interesting people. She carefully tucked the business cards and contact information she'd received into her purse, already planning to share these stories with Jessica at graduation. But the most significant transformation was happening in Jessica Martinez. As she prepared the cabin for landing, she found herself making eye contact with each passenger, offering genuine smiles and assistance. The armor of indifference she had built up over months was cracking, revealing the person her grandmother had raised her to be. What none of them realized was that their story was already spreading far beyond the confines of Flight 1247. Passengers had been sharing updates on social media, and several had tagged Stephen Curry in their posts. The video that Marcus had discreetly recorded was gaining traction online, but not for the reasons anyone expected. The story wasn't going viral because of celebrity involvement, but because it represented something people were hungry for. Proof that kindness still existed, that human connection was still possible, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments could become extraordinary when people chose compassion over indifference. As the Atlanta skyline came into view, each passenger was carrying more than just their luggage off the plane. They were carrying renewed faith in human goodness and a reminder that how we treat each other, especially in the small, everyday moments, defines who we are as individuals and as a society. The wheels of Flight 1247 touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport with barely a bump, but the impact of the journey would ripple outward in ways none of the passengers could have imagined. As the plane taxied to the gate, Margaret Thompson gathered her belongings with a lightness in her step that hadn't been there during boarding. Her small purse now contained not just her boarding pass and identification, but business cards from new friends and a renewed sense of faith in the kindness of strangers. "Mrs. Thompson," Stephen said as passengers began standing and reaching for overhead compartments, "it's been an honor to meet you. I hope your great-granddaughter's graduation is everything you've dreamed it would be." "Thank you, Stephen," she replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of gratitude. "You've reminded an old woman that there are still good people in this world. Your parents raised you right." Stephen smiled, thinking of his own grandmother's influence on his character. "I had good teachers along the way, just like your great-granddaughter did." As passengers began deplaning, Jessica Martinez approached Margaret's row. In her hands was a small bottle of water and a packet of honey-roasted peanuts, the airline's standard snack offering. "Mrs. Thompson," Jessica said quietly, "I wanted to apologize again for how I treated you earlier. That wasn't who I want to be, and it certainly wasn't who I was raised to be." She held out the water and snacks. "For your wait at the gate, if you need anything." Margaret accepted the offering, but more importantly, she reached out and gently touched Jessica's hand. "We all have moments we're not proud of, dear. What matters is what we learn from them. Your grandmother would be proud of the person you're choosing to be right now." Jessica's eyes filled with tears. She had mentioned her grandmother only briefly during their conversation, but Margaret had remembered. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As Stephen helped Margaret with her bag one final time, other passengers were having their own moments of connection. Marcus Williams approached Linda Chen with a business proposal. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, handing her his business card. "My company has a community outreach budget that's been underutilized. What if we partnered on some educational initiatives? I'd like to make a real difference, not just write checks." Linda's face lit up. "I have a dozen programs that need funding and corporate mentorship. This could change everything for my students." Sarah, the single mother, was approached by both Linda and Marcus. "If you get that work-from-home position," Linda said, "I know some great after-school programs in the Atlanta area. And Marcus," she turned to the businessman, "didn't you mention your company has locations nationwide? Maybe there's an opportunity here?" As passengers filed off the plane, Tom Richardson, the veteran flight attendant, pulled Jessica aside. "I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone has a breakthrough moment," he said. "If you're serious about rediscovering why you took this job, I'd like to help. I'm working on a training program for new attendants focused on the human side of service. Could use someone with your energy and perspective." Jessica nodded eagerly. "I'd love that. I think I forgot that this job isn't just about safety demonstrations and beverage service. It's about taking care of people during their journey." "Exactly," Tom smiled. "And speaking of journeys, don't give up on your modeling and acting dreams. But remember that the most compelling performers are those who understand and can connect with all kinds of people. Today's experience, that's going to make you better at everything you do." Meanwhile, Margaret made her way through the terminal with a spring in her step that passengers from earlier flights would have found remarkable. She was texting her great-granddaughter Jessica about the unexpected adventures of her morning flight when she noticed someone familiar at the gate area. Stephen Curry was seated at a nearby gate, surrounded by a small crowd of fans who had recognized him. But instead of the usual celebrity chaos, he was engaged in what appeared to be a meaningful conversation with a group of teenagers wearing Emory University t-shirts. "Are you really saying that being kind is more important than being successful?" one of the teens asked. "I'm saying they're not mutually exclusive," Stephen replied. "In fact, I think the most successful people I know are those who never forgot how to treat others with respect and dignity. Success without character is just achievement. Success with character is legacy." Margaret smiled, recognizing the wisdom in his words. She thought about her great-granddaughter, about to graduate medical school, and felt confident that Jessica had both the achievement and the character to make a real difference in the world. 2 hours later, Margaret stood in the audience at Emory University's medical school graduation ceremony, tears streaming down her face as Dr. Jessica Thompson crossed the stage. The diploma represented years of sacrifice, study, and determination, but Margaret's mind kept returning to the morning's flight and the reminder that education and achievement were most meaningful when paired with compassion and respect for others. After the ceremony, as Margaret hugged her great-granddaughter, she shared the story of her morning flight. "You know what struck me most," Margaret said. "It wasn't just that the famous basketball player stood up for me. It was how that one act of kindness changed everyone around us. People started seeing each other as human beings instead of inconveniences." Dr. Jessica Thompson listened intently, recognizing the lesson in her great-grandmother's story. "That's what I want to remember as I start my residency," she said. "Every patient is someone's grandmother, someone's child, someone who deserves dignity and respect regardless of their insurance status or ability to pay." Back at the airport, as Stephen waited for his connecting flight to Los Angeles, he received a notification that the video from Flight 1247 was trending on social media. But as he read the comments and shared stories, he realized that the focus wasn't on his celebrity involvement. Instead, people were sharing their own stories of kindness received and given, of moments when strangers became human beings to each other. One comment particularly struck him. "This isn't about a famous person doing something nice. This is about what happens when we remember to treat each other with basic human dignity. We all have the power to be the person who stands up, speaks out, and shows kindness." Jessica Martinez, now back at her San Francisco base, was called into her supervisor's office the next morning. She had spent the night expecting discipline or termination, but instead found herself in a conversation about leadership and the viral video that had captured her transformation. "We've had a dozen passengers from that flight contact us," her supervisor said, "not to complain, but to praise the way you handled the situation after the initial incident. More importantly, we've had inquiries from other airlines about our customer service training. It seems your experience has started a conversation about what hospitality really means." Jessica was offered a position in the airline's training department, developing programs that emphasized the human connection aspect of air travel. It wasn't the modeling career she had imagined, but it was a chance to impact thousands of future flight attendants and, by extension, millions of passengers. Marcus Williams returned to his Manhattan office with a new perspective on corporate responsibility. Within 6 months, his company had launched a scholarship program that had already supported dozens of first-generation college students. More importantly, Marcus had begun mentoring young professionals from backgrounds similar to his own, remembering Margaret's words about success creating opportunities for others. Linda Chen's classroom in Oakland became a hub of activity as Marcus's company partnered with her school district on multiple initiatives. Her students, many of whom had never imagined attending college, were now touring corporate offices and meeting successful professionals who looked like them and came from neighborhoods like theirs. But perhaps the most significant impact was immeasurable, the ripple effect of kindness that spread far beyond Flight 1247. Passengers shared the story with friends and family, emphasizing not the celebrity involvement, but the simple power of choosing compassion over indifference. Flight attendants around the country began approaching their jobs with renewed purpose. Travelers started looking up from their phones and engaging with fellow passengers as human beings rather than obstacles to their comfort. 6 months later, Margaret Thompson received an invitation that made her cry tears of joy. Stephen Curry's foundation was hosting a community service event in Oakland, and they had invited her to be a guest speaker about the power of intergenerational wisdom and connection. Standing before an audience of young people and community leaders, Margaret shared the story of Flight 1247, but her message was broader than one morning's journey. I learned that day that age and status and wealth don't determine a person's worth, she said. What determines worth is how we treat each other, especially when we think no one is watching. Every single day we have opportunities to be the person who stands up, who speaks out, who shows kindness. We don't need to be famous or powerful to change someone's day, and maybe their life. In the audience, Stephen Curry smiled and applauded, remembering the woman who had reminded him that true greatness isn't measured by points scored or championships won, but by the lives we touch and the kindness we spread. The story of Flight 1247 became more than a viral moment. It became a reminder that in an increasingly disconnected world, the simple act of treating each other with dignity and respect remains revolutionary. It proved that ordinary people in ordinary moments have extraordinary power to create change, one interaction at a time. And somewhere in Atlanta, Dr. Jessica Thompson continued her residency, carrying with her great-grandmother's story and the lesson that healing begins not with medical knowledge alone, but with the fundamental recognition of each person's inherent worth and dignity. The flight had lasted only 5 hours, but its impact would last a lifetime. For everyone who witnessed it, shared it, and chose to carry its message forward into their own daily interactions with the world.